Welcome to All the F Words,
a podcast where two writer friends, nearly 30 years apart, explore everything we give an F about. I'm Gabi Moskowitz.
And I'm Joanne Green. On each episode of All the F Words, we'll focus on a theme starting with the letter F. Things like fear, 40, fancy pants, and maybe even fornication. Or maybe not.
We'll share stories from our lives and our distinct generational perspectives and look to experts for insights and ideas.
Today we're going to talk about fighting. How often we fight with our partners. You may be shocked, I was. And how we can fight more constructively.
Let's start out with the definition of fighting from Webster's dictionary. We've got to use weapons or physical force to try to hurt someone or defeat an enemy. There's to be involved in a battle, a struggle, sort of wage war. And then there's to argue in an angry way, which is what I think most of us talk about when we talk about fighting, as in he and his wife are always fighting about money. Those people fight with each other all the time. Does that about match your understanding of fighting, Joanne?
Yeah. I for some reason, I have a reaction to the word, even when we said that we were going to devote an episode to this. And I think it's a visceral reaction from childhood. You know, first of all, I say I'm a lover, not a fighter, right? But I think I was really taught to be a lady. Obviously, that teaching failed, but it was this whole notion of girls aren't supposed to fight, women are not supposed to be aggressive in any way. And I know this led to a lot of us sublimating our anger, which is totally unhealthy. Anger is obviously part of being human. And I'm guessing that fighting is a reasonable response to disagreement. Were you raised with Gabi?
Well, I wouldn't say I was encouraged to fight. And I definitely know what you're talking about. I definitely remember thinking of fighting as something that boys did. And I was very nervous and anxious about conflict as a kid. But I definitely came from a family that fights. We weren't like always fighting, but we really had a template for fighting. And I'm married now to someone who came from a family that didn't fight a lot. And so we're different in that way. And it wasn't that there was more conflict in one family versus the other. It was more just that we had different ways of expressing it. But I think that I very much relate to what you're saying about having a sense that I wasn't supposed to demonstrate anger, but I still did. At home, more than
at home. So, right. And I think there was a difference between how I behaved in different sorts of situations. But I think what this discouragement from showing anger led to was sort of being mean. And I think little girls can be very mean to each other. It's kind of hidden and insidious and gossipy and talking about people behind their backs rather than going and confronting the person face to face. As an adult, I think I still avoid fighting, but I try to verbalize my discontent without blaming or accusing. Now, I did say try to. I don't think I always succeed at this, but
it's so hard.
That's the goal, is to try to say, I feel this rather than you did this and made me feel this, which is just going to make the other person defensive.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting now having a more adult perspective on arguing and reflecting back on when I was younger. And how I sometimes wonder if I was a little more comfortable. For example, I definitely fought with my little brother, and I would fight with my parents especially when I was a teenager, like the years of, I would say, age 12 to 20. Those are the concentrated years of fighting with my parents. And then I sort of started to outgrow it a little bit. But if I was so comfortable fighting or arguing and expressing my needs in a family situation, another great F word. But I wonder sometimes if I had been more comfortable doing it at school and with friends, if I would have been a little bit more comfortable doing what you're saying, expressing my needs. I think that so often fighting comes from the repression of needs expression until we get like, so we fill up like a hot air balloon, and then all of a sudden the balloon gets punctured and we just well, my metaphor is collapsing, but you know what I mean. Like, we just get so filled up with hot air that then we explode.
We pop. Right.
Yeah. But
now, I'm really interested in what you were saying about you and your husband come from families where fighting played a very different role. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah. He comes from a family where they aren't confrontational. He's from the Midwest. I think it's a very Midwest thing. And I am the child of an attorney and also a mom who's an arguer. And we were all kind of out and loud about our respective needs. And it wasn't horribly dysfunctional. We had a framework, a template for disagreements. And what was that
template?
Conflict followed by sort of going our separate ways and cooling off, and then, you know, most of the time reconnecting and apologizing. And whereas there just wasn't a lot of talking about conflict for Evan and his family. And but you know, it still came up. They just had a really different style. They talked about it a little more softly. And so he and I, it's funny, we went through sort of 2 iterations for 2 very different reasons of misunderstanding the way the other one was approaching conflict. The first one was as we were getting together, and especially when we started living together. There's so much stuff that comes up when you start living together that you never had to deal with before. So, for example, his tendency to leave every single cabinet in the kitchen open. I remember the first time this came up, he had left all the cabinets open, and that's okay. Just a different way of looking for one single fork. And I had it, and I came into the living room and I said, "Why do you need to open up all the cabinet doors? What the hell is the problem? What are you looking for?" And he was very taken aback, and he was reacting very much to my tone, which admittedly was a little bit over the top. And then we got into a fight about the way I was talking to him. And of course I felt like, well, we're not talking about the thing that I'm pissed about. But then in that conversation, we really identified that we come from families that approach conflict in very different ways. You know, it's not necessarily a great thing to bite your husband's head off when he makes a little mistake. It's also maybe not. It's like we were both having a hard time owning our respective sides, and then we figured out this is because we speak different languages. What about
it's different languages, but it's different languages, but it's tone, as you said. So I think perhaps we become accustomed, if we grow up in a family where people are a little bit more verbal with their anger, and that they have a wider range of acceptable tones, we become a little bit inured to it. Is that the right word? Like we develop an extra layer of skin where it doesn't hurt our feelings so immediately. And perhaps he didn't develop that extra layer of skin because he didn't have to exist in his family. So when your tone gets harsh, he really feels attacked. Where if his tone had become harsh, actually what's funny about this is that now, because you know him, if his tone became that harsh, you would think something's really wrong because his tone probably doesn't ever get that harsh.
Well, it's a really interesting thing you just said, because we had this thing happen a few years ago. So as you know, I was born with significant, profound hearing loss, and spent most of my life trying to sit in the front of the classroom always able to lip read, but really struggling to understand people if I couldn't see them. And then about 3 years ago, I got hearing aids, and my entire life changed. I was always able to hear, but I missed a lot. And my auditory processing was very different from most people because I grew up not always getting the full, everything that someone was saying to me. And so when I got hearing aids, I remember for the first few weeks, I kept thinking he was raising his voice because I had never heard the volume of his voice before. And all of this, I kept saying, "What is your problem? Why are you snapping at me?" And he kept saying, I'm not, I'm just talking. So it was really true. I had gotten so accustomed to his speaking voice without hearing aids. And it really was so triggering to think that I was being snapped at all the time for things that I didn't know I was doing. Yeah.
Have you become more like Evan, or has Evan become more like you? I think in couples, when there are two different frameworks on how to fight, for instance, or when to fight, or how to move through the stages of a fight, often someone is compromising more than the other to sort of find what your template's going to be. So I'm curious to know what's happened with the two of you.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that what has happened is, we met when he was 37 and I was 29. So we had spent kind of a long time really becoming who we are, and making that shift into adopting the other's style really didn't happen so much as, and this is something that we're going to talk about when I get into some of the research that I did about recommendations for couples when they fight. It's more that we've gotten quicker at understanding why the other one is speaking the way that they are. So he understands now, if I get a little snappy, that it's not that I'm not attacking him the way that it might feel at first. And I understand that my tone is so important to modulate so that I don't accidentally communicate something to him that I don't mean to communicate. What about you and Fred? Do you come from similar families in that respect?
I don't know about that, but I will say that we don't fight much. I think that we fight way less than most couples, and often when what does happen sometimes is I feel like Fred's being snappy and mean, and often I will react to that, and then I'll say, what's really going on? Like, what's really bothering you? Because I don't think you're really angry at me. I think you're feeling stressed because of something else, and I'm an easy target because I'm your wife, and I'm going to love you no matter what, and I'm going to be here no matter what. So sometimes we're able to get to what that other thing is, and if I can say that compassionately and in a way where he feels heard and understood and not attacked, then we can move forward and sort of figure out what's really bothering him. He feels like I am often critical, and that's been something and it's probably true. I probably am too critical. And so that sometimes like sparks a little disagreement that I'm trying to dictate how things should be done.
Do you feel
because
like
I'm right?
Well, I mean, criticism, it's, you've been married for 40 years, 40 years, right?
41.
Oh my gosh. Wow. So you guys have had a lot of practice. So, when Evan has criticism for me, even though I sometimes really don't like hearing it, I try to, he is so, he's so careful with his criticism that I really, even if I don't like hearing it in the moment, I often think that I try to remember that if this person is giving me feedback, it's coming from a place of love and wanting me to be and do better. But it also holds so much more meaning than if, some jerk on Twitter says I'm stupid.
You're not stupid, Gabi.
Oh, thank you, Joanne.
One of the things that we default to, I think, and that has been really helpful is kindness, right?